Okay. Good morning and welcome to the 12th and final day of hearings on the FY24 executive budget. I'm being told I'm Councilmember Justin Brannan, and I chair the Committee on Finance. We're joined this morning by Councilmembers Vilas, Hudson, Carr, and Moya on Zoom. Welcome, Comptroller Brad Lander and your team. Thank you for joining us today to answer our questions. My questions this morning will largely focus on the city's debt limit, pensions, and the Comptroller's Office market report. Before we start, I have to recognize this is our 12th and final day of hearings, and the Council Finance Division really makes magic happen behind the scenes. Both the staff that join us every day in the chamber and the small army that we have across the street at 250 Broadway for all their efforts in preparing and making these weeks and weeks of hearings happen, including our CFO, Deputy Chief of Staff Tanisha Edwards, the senior staff, Finance Director Richard Lee, Managing Director Jonathan Rosenberg, Deputy Directors Isha Wright, Chima Oberchair, Emra Adev, and Paul Simone, Chief Economist and Assistant Director Delara Danaku, Assistant Director Elizabeth Hoffman, the Supervising Economist Paul Sturm, Andrew Wilbur, and William Shearmatang, Unit Heads Aliyah Ali, Jack Story, Julia Haramis, Florentine Kabor, and James Reyes, and my committee counsel, Mike Toomey, who's been here with me for all 700 hours, and all the finance analysts who work really hard behind the scenes. I'll read all this stuff later. Okay, I'm now going to turn to our committee counsel to swear in the Comptroller, and let's get moving.
Good morning. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee, and to respond honestly to councilmember questions? Brad Lander.
Yes, I do.
Francesco Brindisi.
I do.
Krista Olson.
I do.
Thank you. You may begin.
Good morning, Chair Brannan, Council Members Vilas, Hudson, Carr, and Moya. Congrats on making it to day 12. You've missed a beautiful week of weather in New York City. We tried to show it to you on the cover of our budget report, but thank you to you and your staff for all you're doing here. With me is Francesco Brindisi, Executive Deputy Comptroller, and Krista Olson, Deputy Comptroller for Budget. The $111.6 billion FY25 executive budget, as you well know, reflects a modestly stronger fiscal position for the city than the preliminary budget. It includes a combined $2.3 billion increase in projected tax revenues for this fiscal year and next, and the FY25 gap is manageable even with the cancellation of the third round of PEGs that the mayor had announced last fall, and with the restoration of funding for some of the cuts to the Department of Education and the NYPD. While these positive indicators are heartening, my office continues to project substantial out-year gaps, which will take careful planning, honest budgeting, and strong fiscal management to close. Starting with the economic picture, New York City's economy has been reasonably strong and is expected to continue growing at a moderate pace. The number of private sector in New York is now higher than before the pandemic. Thank you. Office using jobs at an all-time high, and the proportion of New Yorkers that are employed is higher than it has ever been before. I'll actually add this morning just the pension funds are doing quite well. Fiscal year to date, 8.5% returns. They are also at the pension funds are at historic highs, both in dollar amount and in percent of funding, while we continue to implement a strong, responsible investing program that attends to environmental and social and governance goals as well. So there's a lot of good news. However, plenty of things to keep an eye on. The new jobs added in the past year have continued to be in relatively few and relatively lower wage industries: healthcare, social services, food services, education. Job growth has stagnated in some of the higher wage service industries that are key to the city's economy: finance, technology, business and professional services. And that lack of momentum, combined with an anticipated cooling off of economic growth nationally, suggests that the city's economic activity will grow at a slower pace over the next few years. As members of this council well know, residential rents continue to be near record highs at an average of $3,500 a month. A sign of continued attractiveness to the city, which is good, but far too high for families in our neighborhoods and all across our city, and a deterrent to new business startup and job growth. The slumping commercial real estate market caused by the shift to remote and hybrid work continues to be a serious challenge, but thus far, the, quote, doomsday scenario that many worried about has not materialized. And while we see continued hard times, especially for Class B and C portfolios, we don't see that doomsday scenario on the horizon. As you know, that stronger economy enabled OMB to restore some of the cuts that had previously been announced to cultural institutions, schools, libraries, the NYPD, and to put down payments on some chronically under-budgeted costs and fiscal cliffs. But those funds, including additional support from the state, only partially cover the needs that we know, the expenses we know are going to materialize in the coming year. Important education programs funded with expiring federal stimulus dollars have been maintained, but in some cases only funded for 1 year. While more realistic funding was provided for the city FEPS program as currently implemented, we estimate that still an additional $500 million will actually be spent on city FEPS in each year of the plan. And of course, while the April financial plan did not further reduce essential city services, cuts to critical services and institutions from the prior pegs remain. The administration reported gaps of $5.5 billion in FY26, rising to $5.7 billion in FY28. But when you add in those areas of under budgeting and fiscal cliffs to correct, my office sees revised gaps of $2.6 billion in FY25, the year that must be balanced, which is 2.3% of total revenues, growing to approximately $8.5 billion in FY26 and the out years. That's about 7.5%. Beyond those more predictable areas like city FEPS, Carter cases, where we've got trends and we can understand what we know is very likely to be spent, there are three big areas of just greater uncertainty. The cost of providing services to asylum seekers, the cost of implementing the state's class size mandate, and the cost of expansion of rental assistance. My office expects that the costs associated with asylum seekers will be lower than budgeted in FY25 by $1.3 billion, mainly due to lower projections of household and shelter, extending the trend, which is now relatively stable over the last few months. But the projection is subject to an unusual degree of uncertainty due to so many things we don't know. The unknown trajectory of border crossings and arrivals, especially given the uncertainty of the federal election, as well as changes in city policies, including the haphazard implementation of shelter time limits, which lacks the case management services or even just the simple outcomes tracking that are really necessary for us to have a clear handle on what's actually going on. And expenses continue to be unnecessarily high because of the overuse of emergency procurement without adequate cost controls in staffing in many of our emergency contracts, as my office has repeatedly documented on the slow pivot to competitive procurement. We were pleased with the cancellation and the ending of the .go contract and a commitment to move to real RFPs with cost competition, but we have not yet seen that. In FY26 and 27, though, the city is budgeting for $1 billion of annual state aid that is not in the state budget, so that is a fiscal risk. And in FY28, the financial plan does not include any expenses for asylum seekers, while it's quite likely to continue, although that is 3 years out. Implementation of the class size mandate is not fully funded in the current budget, and we estimate that fully funding it would cost an additional $467 million in FY26, $933 million in FY27, and $1.4 billion in FY28, and we have factored that into our reestimate. And we don't, in our reestimate, include any projections of expanding rental assistance, city FEPS, beyond its current levels, but of course the council passed legislation and is in litigation that would extend it substantially more. With those two adjustments we do make, my office projects a surplus of $341 million in the current fiscal year, a gap of $1.27 billion in FY25, growing to $9 billion in 26, over $10 billion in 27, and $13 billion in FY28. Despite the threat of substantial gaps in future fiscal years, the executive budget did make some positive moves to restore core services, which I am enthusiastic about. But there are areas where additional investment is still required. The Department of Education, first and foremost, given the expiration of federal COVID-19 aid, a good reprieve on $500 million, combining local and state funding, including coordinators for students in temporary housing, mental health support, pre-K, community schools, but other critical programs like arts education, Summer Rising, and Learning to Work are only funded for the current year. And of course, on 3K, a fiscal cliff remains in the out years, and the restoration that was made does not address cuts of $170 million that were made to early childhood education, including 3K and pre-K. And the city does have an obligation to make good on its prior commitments to pay early childhood education workers in community-based organizations on parity with their public school peers. Most just encouraging and promising programs of recent years, really showing what it looks like when kids get a real opportunity, when parents have the chance to work. So I support the council's request to fund that at $25 million, as well as there's a good conversation underway about making our schools accessible for students and families with disabilities. That, fortunately, is a capital commitment, and I'll come back to this, but there is some room in the capital budget thanks to the debt limit increase, and the city should increase the capital commitment by $450 million over the next 5 years. Right now, fewer than a third of New York City's schools are fully accessible to students or their family members with physical disabilities. One area I've really been focused on, and I hope you will too, is CUNY, the city's best driver of economic mobility. But it has faced successive rounds of cuts totaling $95 million now by this year in this administration. In addition to restoring baseline pegs, the city should expand critical programs like ASAP and Reconnect. I've been visiting CUNY campuses all across the city. Was just talking to Councilmember Carr about my visit to College of Staten Island. I'm going to Hostos and Lehman and BMCC. Talked with the interim president of Kingsborough. It's extraordinary what is happening on those campuses, the next generation of New York's workers and entrepreneurs, but we cannot starve them of resources. While providing only small fiscal relief, cuts to libraries and cultural programs still leave an outsized impact on the students, immigrants, and many others that they serve. You guys have had a lot about that, so it's in my written testimony, but I won't go through it here. But I really do urge you to make restorations to the culturals and libraries. One thing though on the culturals that I learned in conversation with them that I thought you guys should know is the cultural institute. The city has not increased funding in the cultural or library budgets for COLAs for staff, despite the fact that obviously now all city workers, other than a few of us, and human service workers have seen cost of living adjustments. Those workers did not get any adjustments in the contracts from the city. Okay, the executive budget, appropriately switching to the capital budget now. The executive budget appropriately included an update to the city's capital commitment plan with increases to the school construction authority, borough-based jails, and some other critical areas. Once the state adopted legislation that raises the city's capacity to incur debt by $14 billion over 2 years. The city now needs to increase capital funding in a couple of other areas, especially critical housing development programs called for in the council's budget response, and also cuts identified in the recent work by New York Housing Conference. An additional capital investment of $2.5 billion over the next 5 years would fund the construction and preservation of affordable community-controlled homes, both ownership and rental, providing stability and wealth-building opportunities for low-income and working-class New Yorkers. We need to put that money in the budget. We need to make sure HPD gets it out in communities. That is the most critical issue facing so many New Yorkers and our economy. This council has focused on the fact that as part of the executive budget, OMB also extended the restoration of the Water Authority's rental payments to the city for fiscal years 26 to 28. So it's now in all 5 fiscal years, totaling $1.4 billion to the general fund. While these resources are, of course, covering some essential services in the city budget, The proposed rate structure is regressive, falling on the backs of low-income homeowners and renters. The water rate structure should be reformed to provide relief for low-income New Yorkers and sound enforcement mechanisms. And of course, in the face of the climate crisis, as highlighted in my office's recent investigation of flash flood preparedness, we are woefully underprepared for extreme rainfall events. We need to use resources that are supposed to be dedicated for water to address our urgent stormwater management and sewer maintenance needs, and also consider instituting a stormwater fee to ensure that those costs are more equally shared. As I come to conclude, I want to just talk a minute about a stronger fiscal framework for the city. I was intrigued to see that yesterday the mayor announced on updating the city's fiscal responsibilities. I saw some reporting that raised questions about the motivations of the Charter Revision Commission, but I will say it is a good time to focus on stronger fiscal responsibility, and so I'm going to mention a couple here, and in the coming weeks we'll actually lay out some ideas, because if people are serious about modernizing the city's fiscal framework, which was essentially adopted at the fiscal crisis 50 years ago, this would be a great time to do it. So while we should be ambitious in our capital program to make the infrastructure investments that are necessary for our long-term thriving, we've got to manage that debt responsibly. The expanded debt capacity Albany passed should be accompanied by new policies that make sure the long-standing threshold of 15% of tax revenues for debt service is actually a real threshold and not just something, sort of an idea in our debt service policy. And we really need a comprehensive, accurate assessment of infrastructure needs to better inform that spending. My office did an audit recently of the annual Ames report, which is supposed to tell us the state of repair of our infrastructure. It does not tell us the state of good repair of our infrastructure, and it's irresponsible not to have it. The city's budget should also accurately reflect the city's expenses. As you know, these areas of under-budgeting that are perpetually in the budget make the budget just not a real, true, document articulating what we'll be spending. That's something that should be improved. Strategic investments in areas like special education services may cost money in the short run, but then would address those issues of growing Carter cases, which are now over $1 billion every year. And instead of cutting core services, the city's fiscal health and lives of New Yorkers would be better served by planning and implementing long-term efficiency measures as a regular process in each financial plan, and not just a kind of peg randomly announced at the whim of the mayor or the budget director with a 2-week response, but at every budget plan, and with a focus on those things that will achieve long-term efficiencies without detracting from services. Finally, and perhaps predictably, I continue to advocate for a formula-based approach to contributing to our long-term reserves, which are still far from sufficient to see us through the length of an average recession. My office, under the leadership of Executive Deputy Comptroller Brindisi, has offered a thoughtful approach for such a formula, and I urge the Council and the Administration to adopt it or something similar. Stronger fiscal management is not contrary to deeper investments in the programs that create opportunities and address severe affordability challenges facing working-class New Yorkers. Quite the opposite. Stronger fiscal management helps us to target and preserve resources to where they are most needed, so that New York City can remain a place of opportunity for New Yorkers at all income levels, and so that our city can grow and flourish in the years ahead. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Comptroller. We've also been joined by Councilmember Williams. I want to jump into talk about the debt limit. In December 23, prior to the release of the January plan, your office reported that by the end of FY24, without assuming any increases in the TFA, that the city would have 33.5 6% of the total. By the end of FY26, your office estimated that the city would still have $27.7 billion of remaining debt incurring power. With the additional TFA increase that we saw included in the state budget, what does your office estimate is the city's current debt limit for GO and TFA debt combined for FY25?
Thank you for this question. I really want to praise my team here because we did a deep dive on debt affordability, and we actually commissioned, in addition to the internal work we do, we commissioned a consultant to dive a little deeper. So if you are interested in the questions of debt affordability and the debt limit, they're on our website. We can get them to you. We estimate that the general debt limit will total in FY25 $136.5 billion. And that the city's indebtedness applicable to that debt will be $108.9 billion. So that leaves a remaining debt margin of $27.5 billion, which is 20.2% of the debt limit remaining by the end of fiscal year 25. And by the end of 26, we estimate the remaining debt margin to be $25.5 billion, so $2 billion lower, with 18.3% of debt limit remaining at that point.
Do you feel that those are appropriate amounts of remaining debt incurring power?
We do. We feel that the $14 billion increase was appropriate and responsible, that it gives the city room for its 10-year capital commitment plan, even with the adjustments that the administration brought forward. I'll say two things here. We do believe that a stronger approach to ensuring that we stay below the 15% annual threshold is critical. We're well below now. We're at about 10%, but it is going to grow in the coming years. And that really is what we want to measure for, because the way the debt limit is calculated is really not related to what we're actually can afford in terms of debt service, or even to the value of its property. So we do think the $14 billion increase was appropriate, that it should cover us in the coming years of the financial plan, that we can afford that debt, but some new tools are needed to keep an eye for the long run.
So the calculation of the city's geo debt limit uses a 5-year average value of the full valuation of the city's taxable real estate. I think one reason we've seen declining debt limits is because during COVID, FY21, there was a significant decline in that number, nearly 8.5% from FY20. It wasn't until FY23 that the city's full valuation of taxable real estate exceeded the pre-COVID values. So if the city's real estate values keep increasing at this modest pace as COVID years drop out of the formula, we assume that the debt limit will greatly increase. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'm actually going to let, I think that Francesco may be the only person who actually understands the special equalization ratios that inform this debt limit, and he has persuaded me that on the one hand, it's not a very good formula, and on the other hand, given the framework that we have, we're in a reasonable spot. But let me let you respond to the question.
I actually think my colleagues at the Council of Finance know about the special equalization.
I apologize.
Well.
I'm sure they do as well. The only person I've talked to.
Anyway, the formula itself, the methodology that for the calculation of the debt limit is based on something that is done at the state level by the State Department of Taxation and Finance. And, we went into a lot of detail about how that happens. But the short version of the growth rate going forward of the debt limit is that what we've seen in the FY25 assessment roll from Department of Finance is a growth rate of market value of 0% for FY25. That's going to be picked up in 2026 by the formulas for the debt limit, which means that although the COVID year, FY21, is going to roll out, the growth rate is going to remain very moderate going forward. So
would the debt ceiling start increasing once all the COVID years are no longer?
The debt limit will keep increasing because throughout from 24 to 33 is going to continue to increase, but it's going to increase at a moderate pace. And it's going to, be held down by the fact that market values have not grown so much in 25.
Thank you. What do you think the city's main priority should be with its now increased capital capacity?
Housing. There are other important issues. I mentioned the accessibility in our schools. $450 million would go a long way to making our schools more accessible. Climate resilience is is critical. The Department of Environmental Protection was asking only for $22.5 million to modernize some of the critical catch basins that clog during extreme rainfall, but they've got a much more ambitious program that is necessary to protect us from those extreme rainfall storms that we've seen, as well as from coastal storms. So I think, whatever, the schools and accessibility is important, climate resilience is important, and I continue to support the plan to build the borough-based jails and close Rikers Island. But the number one need from my point of view in kind of capital and infrastructure is affordable housing. It is housing affordability that most threatens the city's growth if it can't be a place where families can live and stay. And so the council's $2.5 billion over 5-year request, I think, is a good one. We do need, to enable the private sector to build more housing, but realistically, if a chunk of that housing is going to be affordable for working and middle-class families and to help us end homelessness, it is going to and have to involve city capital subsidies. So I'm a big supporter of that investment.
Do you think the administration has the staffing and administrative capacity to deliver on that new capital capacity?
We did a report recently on HPD's capacity questions, and one interesting thing we found, we went in thinking that staff vacancies were really the issue, but the report concluded that they had actually done a pretty good job of filling staff vacancies after the pandemic, but we found a bunch of other pain points in the development process. There was some significant experience loss because the folks that left during the pandemic had been there a long time. So there are some critical training issues. They need new technology, and we've recommended some really modest increases that would go a long way in HPD's technology. And some development pain points as well. It didn't used to be the case, for example, that the city's Office of Management and Budget essentially re-underwrote every affordable housing deal that kind of gave program parameters. So we've got a set of recommendations for what HPD could do to move faster, to get the money out the door, but we can't let it be that, they didn't get the staff capacity is limited, so the money didn't get out the door, so next year we project less in capital. We have to go ambitiously in the other direction.
I'll talk about the pensions. You mentioned in your testimony the city's retirement funds are at a return of, is it 8.5 across all 5 pension funds?
Fiscal year to date, and obviously what really matters is where we are at June 30th, and that's, 38 days from now. But yes, right now, performance across the 5 systems is 8.5%. I have the number for each system if you want,
And that's
they hover around 8.5.
The actuarial target's 7%, right?
That's right.
So that's great.
It is great, yes. Yeah. And, one nice, but we have a very wise, slow-rolling system. So if we were to end the year at 8.5%, I think each 0.5% is worth like $500 million. But it gets rolled into the budget over a 5-year smoothing period, which is really helpful when we have a year in which we underperform. But yes, it's a strong sign of our Bureau of Asset Management and the pension funds team. Returns have been good. We just adopted a new strategic asset allocation across all 5 funds that takes advantage of the legislation we got passed in Albany last year, giving us a little more room to invest in private markets investments. Yesterday, we announced this wonderful investment that NYSERS is making, along with Community Preservation Corporation and related, in the preservation of 35,000 rental units that were put at risk by the Signature Bank collapse. So, yes, the returns are strong and the broader responsible investing program is strong as well.
I want to ask you a little bit about that announcement, but could you tell us what are some of the drivers of the pension system returns?
So the biggest driver this year has been that public equities have been performing very well. And, basically of the pension portfolio, roughly half of it is in public equities, roughly a little less than a quarter is in fixed income, and a little more than a quarter and growing is in private markets, private equity, infrastructure, real estate, et cetera. Fixed income has not been doing that well, but public equities, the stock market broadly, both in the U.S. and ex-U.S., have been performing strongly, and that has been driving our pension fund growth this
Could
year.
you talk a bit about how you're working to implement the strategic asset allocations for each system?
Yeah, so we do that every strategic asset allocation you do every 3 to 5 years. And we work, each of the funds, the 5 funds, has a general consultant. And so our economics and team at Bureau of Asset Management works closely with them. And you look at the risk and return expectations based on projections of where the economy will be and adjust a little more in infrastructure, a little less in fixed income. The main thing that happened this year was in my first year in 2022, my office led the effort in Albany to remove some of the restrictions on public pension funds in New York that limited it so that you could only invest essentially up to 25% in all of the private markets and alternative investments basket. And that lagged far behind what most of our peers were doing. So the legislation increased the limit to 35%. We're not going all the way from 25 to 35, but the strategic asset allocation that each plan adopted increased private markets investments modestly, but a little bit across each plan. And now we're working hard to implement that plan. And the great staff we have are, slowly, you do it kind of step by step, moving money into the places that asset allocation identified.
So yesterday, you announced along with the mayor and the public advocate that NYSERS will invest up to $60 million from the pension access to preserve 35,000 rent-stabilized housing units that were impacted by the collapse of Signature Bank last year. Could you talk about why that decision was made to utilize the funds to preserve those housing units?
Absolutely. This is such a great, this could have been such a disaster, and I feel proud not just of NYSERS and our office, but of the whole housing community that came together, which is why we really had such a good group there yesterday. So a year ago when Signature Bank collapsed, there was a lot of attention on the deposits, as of course there should be, and it was quickly made clear that they were insured. And New York Community Bank, part of Flagstar, took over their deposits and liabilities, but they did not want to take their rental housing loan portfolio, and that raised a lot of questions because people knew that Signature had been reputed to essentially do sloppy lending, and there was real concern about what that would mean. So the FDIC took over receivership for all of Signature's loan portfolio, real estate loan portfolio, and announced a process of putting it in 14 different pools and bidding it out. We immediately all got to work, those of us that care a lot about housing investment, to talk about how that could go, because you can't have those things just grabbed by vulture investors who might look to maximize returns, but at the expense of the tenants or the buildings or the conditions of people living in them. Fortunately, the FDIC, their mission includes attending to housing preservation, and so a great collaboration came together, led by Community Preservation Corporation, led by Rafael Sestero, with involving Related Funds Management and Neighborhood Restore, and they put a partnership together that bid on the 6 of the 14 pools that had the rent-stabilized and at-risk housing stock. And I had been talking to them for some months, making clear if an investment from the city pension funds could meet our return thresholds, but also help them meet the capital requirements to do it, we would be thrilled to. It got diligenced by our real estate team. It's got investment returns. I think the anticipated IRR net of fees there is 11%, so well above the threshold that we talked about. And it is contributing to preserving 35,000 units of rent, 80% of which is rent stabilized, that really could have been at risk. This is like a real one of those win-win examples where you can do something that secures the retirement security of teachers and cops and firefighters and school crossing guards, and at the same time invest in a way that ensures the stability of New York City's housing.
Your office recently released its annual claims report. It showed that the city paid out over $1.5 billion in claims in FY23 for 13,227 claims and lawsuits against the city. This is $110.9 million less than what was paid out in FY22, but it's still well above the recent average annual payment. Could you talk about what's driving the increase in claims and lawsuit costs against the city over the last 2 years?
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, both of those figures for the last 2 years, 1.45 and 1.56 billion dollars. That's a lot of money to be spending on claims against the city. There are some unique things. I mean, a big spike each of the last 2 years is this 25-year-old class action lawsuit called Gulino, in which the city, at the requirement of the state, used tests for teachers that were found in court to be discriminatory. And so Black and Latino teachers sued the city for using those assessments, again, which were state mandated. So I still don't understand why the state is not paying this money. But the courts found the city liable, and that's hundreds of millions of dollars in payouts. Now, there are areas that are more predictable. So we did this report on crash claims every year. One of the biggest areas of claims last year, I think $174 million, was crashes caused by city vehicles, whatever, sanitation trucks and police cars and DOT and parks vehicles. And there is not real accountability to the agencies or the drivers of those vehicles. Like, they get in a crash, somebody brings a claim, it's settled, the payout goes, and that driver's still driving, that agency. So it's a lot of things.
Is that higher? It's higher than it's been?
Oh yeah, it doubled, I think, from, I have the number. Yeah, in 2014 it was 89 million, and in 2023 it was 174 million. Oh my God. So it has grown quite a bit, and there just is not a structure in place. My office has recommended putting the cost of claims settlements on the agency that incurs them, like putting that in the budget and saying to a commissioner, look, if you impose a system that gets your drivers to drive more responsibly, or you put in, for the appropriate vehicles, speed delimiters, and you reduce this claims payouts, you could keep half the savings and invest that in new programs you want to start. But right now we don't have any claims accountability at the agency level, or in this case, the driver level.
How much has the city paid out, just overall claims? How much have we paid out in the current year so far? Are we on track to go higher than last year?
So through the end of April, we've paid out $1 billion, so tracking pretty close to where we are. I mean, we don't know exactly because the claims are kind of lumpy, but yeah, I think probably on the same order of magnitude of roughly $1.4 billion for the year.
Okay, I want to talk about nonprofit contract payments. The city continues to struggle to pay its contracted nonprofit providers in a timely manner. Back in January, your office published a report stating that 2/3 of contracts were submitted late for registration. The report disclosed that this is a worsening trend, and delays in registration, as we all know, can have serious ramifications for nonprofits. We heard that a lot over the past couple of weeks in public testimony. What are the factors that has led to nearly 80% of late contract registrations in the first half of 2024?
Yeah, this remains, as you know, a real passion of mine as somebody who worked in the nonprofit sector for a long time, and who's close to people who continue to. And this has just gotten gradually worse in recent years, and that 80% in the first half of the year, is worse than each of the 3 preceding years. We have taken some good steps. So the council agreed last year for the first time to make its discretionary awards multi-year. That doesn't mean you committed to the dollar amount. So, if you gave somebody a $10,000 award last year, you may or may not give them an award this year, but they got a 3-year contract. And so if you do, the money can be added to that contract without having to go through the whole registration process again. So that didn't show up for you last year because it was the first year of that, but it is going to show up for you this year. So many of your discretionary grantees are not going to have to go through the contract registration process again on council discretionary awards. So that's an example of like a really good step we've taken that next year should get some of these. Well, it's interesting, it won't even get the percentage of registrations down because they won't go through registration, but you'll have happy happy nonprofit. So that was good. We made a change in our office where you can go up to a 25% amendment of the contract. So if there is a COLA increase that the city gives, you also don't have to go through registration again. So that is really helping. But other things are just not getting where they need to be. And even emergency contracts, which are supposed to be much faster, still have wound up overwhelmingly come to our office because until they get to our office, they aren't set up in the financial system for payment. 85% of them come long after the start of the contract. So we continue to make a bunch of recommendations to City Hall about what could be done to fix this, a visible contract stat system where the public could really see what is going on. There's some legislation that's been proposed to put timelines on the agencies that do the processing. We're currently the only agency with timelines on the processing. We have only 30 days to register the contracts once they reach our office. We get over 10,000 a year. We have met the 30-day deadline on every single contract that has reached our office this term. Our average is 17. Deadlines, no one loves a deadline, but they are really good for compelling performance, and I think that legislation has some things to recommend it.
Okay, I'm going to turn it to some of my colleagues for questions. We've also been joined by Council Members Brooks Powers on Zoom and Council Member Farias. I'm going to start with questions from Council Member Carr, and we'll come back.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chair. Comptroller, it's great to see you, and thank you for your recent visit to CSI. It's truly a gem of the CUNY system. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the financial structure reforms you were alluding to that perhaps may become part of charter revision consideration. You know, I think that the structure we have from the recovery from the bankruptcy of the city, or near bankruptcy of the city in the 70s, has been incredibly helpful to keeping the city fiscally solvent. And so I just want to know your thoughts on some of the key aspects of the system we have, namely the balanced budget requirement, budget deadlines, the oversight of the Fiscal Control Board. Are these still things that you think are relevant today and are important in including in whatever structure may emerge moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I really agree with it. You know, 50 years ago, the city faced a fiscal crisis, and out of that developed some of the best standards for fiscal responsibility of any city anywhere, not just balanced budget requirements, but by GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. We're one of the few cities to do that. You know, a 4-year plan with quarterly updates. So yes, the core set of reforms that were adopted in the Financial Emergency Act broadly should be continued. Some of them, though, are continued currently only through bond covenants because the Financial Emergency Act expired. So one example, we've got this really good feature where property tax collections go immediately into what's called the General Debt Service Reserve that's held by the state comptroller and is used to pay our debt before it comes back to the city to pay everything else. So of course, that makes our, it is good for our ratings and our fiscal discipline, but that is not in state law, that's in the bond covenants. That should be updated, and we've got a few other suggestions like that to make an efficiencies program regular part of the budgeting cycle and to give you more incentives for things that actually produce long-term savings instead of just kind of one-time vacancy hits. I mentioned the claims update, and we'll have some more coming.
Absolutely. So I'm glad to hear that. I think we're on the same page. Another question I'd like to ask about, some of my colleagues and I were talking to the Parks Commissioner on Monday about tree and sidewalk program and claims that come to your office from folks who have the money to do the repairs up front, even when the city has accepted responsibility for damage done to sidewalk by street trees. And in the past, when I worked for my predecessor, Minority Leader Matteo, what we found is the Comptroller's office was denying claims because the impact of the street trees was cumulative over time, as opposed to a singular incident where the 90-day clock clearly started for a claim to be made with your office. And this is a problem that long predates your tenure. And so I was just wondering if your thoughts on that. Why can't we have a clock that begins when the city accepts responsibility for the damage, as opposed to this sort of nebulous, well, the tree got damaged the sidewalk maybe a few years ago, and then it drip, drip, drip over time. created an unsafe condition. And this would actually entitle so many New Yorkers to receive a reimbursement, at least in part, for work that the city should be doing.
That's a good question that I'll have to get back to you on the answer. We don't have our claims experts here with us today, but I promise that we'll look into this, figure out, why someone in the past had said that couldn't be done, and take another look at it and see if it's something that would be appropriate. I certainly remember from my days as a council member representing a district with a lot of street trees, what a significant issue this can be. Actually, I remember. You go door knocking, and you ask people, what's the big issue? And, they're looking past you at their tree, and they're like, oh, I remember the time when. So, yes, it's a real issue. Let me get back to you with an answer.
Thank you, Comptroller. Thank you, Chair.
Questions from Councilmember Williams, and we've been joined by Councilmembers Sanchez and Powers.
Hello. You released a report, I think, a few months ago about MWBE utilization. And outside of the report, is there anything else that you think your office or respective offices in the mayor's administration could be doing differently to address the low percentage rates?
Yeah. Yes, so we put out, actually we do two different reports each year. One is on MWBE and city purchasing, and that one, has found that, found this year that while under Michael Gardner's leadership, a lot of effort is underway, the numbers have just not moved that much. Still roughly 5% of overall city procurement to MWBEs, and less than 15% even of the procurement that's subject to local law, the local law that covers it. The other report looks at our pension investments, because we want to make sure that on what we control, we're doing better. And there, I'm pleased to say, we grew from, still too low, but 11.68% to 12.86%. That was $2.7 billion more in the hands of Black and brown and women asset managers. And we've got plans that we anticipate will get us to 15% next year and hopefully 20% by 2029. We laid out a bunch of ideas in that report, and I'll give you just a couple of them. And you and I have talked about some of these. The local law exempts nonprofits because, and therefore most of human services, because they're nonprofits, they don't have owners. But much of what those folks are doing with city contracts is subcontracted to for-profits for cleaning and food and transportation, security. So there might be some ways to change that so that that business would be covered by MWBE requirements. Subcontracting in general is a big area of opportunity, but our systems for just seeing who the subcontractors are pretty woeful. So there is a lot. I mean, it's a big, complex system that then, of course, if you're, an MWBE and you just want, where's the portal where I can find an opportunity? Even that doesn't exist.
Does your office have the ability to encourage agencies to debundle contracts? Because sometimes they have like these really large contracts that make it really hard for smaller or MWBE businesses to go out for them and compete.
So two things I'll say here, and there's not exactly, so there's some new and good incentives. The growth of what's called the non-competitive small procurement threshold for MWBEs to 1.5 billion. We started tracking that specifically in the report to say, are agencies using this new tool? And some are better than others, and hopefully they want to do better on the list next year. We're also working with the administration in Albany on alternative delivery methods on capital process reform legislation for construction, and some of the alternative delivery methods, CM Build especially, makes more opportunities for subcontracting rather than sort of the one big prime contractor. And we're talking a lot with DDC, and I know Commissioner Foley, that's something that he cares a lot about.
And I know you mentioned pensions, and I know you and I spoke about this, but also just wondering any efforts, and I know some of this predates you, around like diversifying the boards of the private companies that we are investing in through the pension fund?
Absolutely, yeah, and we actually have some shareholder resolutions this year. This is an area where some meaningful progress has been made. There's two things we do. We ask companies to disclose a board diversity matrix so you can see board diversity, and also make public their EEO1 statements. That's really about their staff diversity. And both of those things have gone from less than 20% of sort of Fortune 500 companies to much higher percentages of folks doing them because of the shareholder resolutions that we and others are bringing, and we'll keep going on that. I can get you more detailed information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to ask, just in your opinion, for expiring federal stimulus funds, the council has really maintained that that is our biggest challenge right now, not the migrant crisis or the cost related to the migrant influx, but grappling with the expiration of temporary dollars that were used in large part to prop up a bunch of permanent programs that people have now come to rely on. A number of initiatives, particularly in education, that were funded with this money are concerning. Could you give us, in your idea, in your estimation, what programs would you prioritize for the city to provide funding to?
Sure, and I think one thing that does bear saying here is there ought to be a broader national effort to get the federal government to keep providing funding for programs that we learned in the pandemic are good, but are not just about the pandemic. Some pandemic funding was for vaccines and testing, but those folks who used it for summer school and expanding 3K and student mental health, none of those needs are gone now that the pandemic is over, and yet we've all kind of accepted, oh, that's the end of the federal aid. I guess we can't, we won't have federal funding for summer rising 3K and student mental health. So that's, I know, not the, none of us control that, but that's how we're in this problem. We realized how valuable those programs are because we provided them. And of course, no one wants to go back once you have those things, but the feds are stopping to provide the money. I guess number one for me is 3K and pre-K. Just the data that shows that those are strong investments is really compelling. I want to see more outcomes about what we're doing, what DOE is doing with the student mental health money. We know we have a mental health crisis with our young people and in our schools, and we need to be spending wisely on that. I don't think we yet have really good data on what's working there because that's an area we need to spend on, but we need to do it on programs that are working. I was really glad to see the social workers restored, so I'm glad that that one is done.
I want to close with just two questions on housing. What do you make of the state's housing package? Do you think the state's legislation will be sufficient to create an appropriate amount of affordable housing in the city?
On its own, no. It is, we'll have to see. The awful lot of what is going to happen now is based on the deadline extension on 421A. So people are, I think, still going to use the old guidelines in a lot of cases that got extended till 2031 because people filed so many permits before the expiration. Things are still shaking out on the new program. I've been really encouraged in Gowanus, which this council, did the Gowanus rezoning on, just to see how much new mixed income housing and affordable housing is going up there. But no, even if it works well, it is not going to come close to creating the overall total housing that's needed, and certainly not the affordable housing that's needed. Probably the biggest thing that I was upset that they didn't include were the housing access voucher program that Senator Kavanaugh had been championing, and that everyone agreed should be part of the package. We want stronger tenant protections. Yes, we want more housing, especially more affordable housing, but we need vouchers. The feds have some vouchers. The city is now paying some vouchers. The state is not funding any vouchers, and so no person can get out of shelter even into many of the units that are being created without some housing subsidy. We could end street homelessness for mentally ill and other street homeless folks if we had the vouchers that could help them off the street into permanent housing units with appropriate social supports. So that's one just kind of big area that's missing. And then, I do think, and I said this before, but I think it was before Housing Chair Sanchez was here, the council's call in its response for the $2.5 billion over 5 years targeted especially to affordable homeownership and affordable nonprofit and community-controlled rental. There's nothing in the state budget for any of that, and we think that is critical. On this, finally, I'll just mention I was pleased to put forward an idea with Micah Lasher in the Daily News this weekend that we're really excited about, modeled on a program some universities do. This would use pension fund dollars rather than subsidy dollars to invest alongside city workers to make it possible for folks to buy homes, because it is now so hard for a teacher or an H&H nurse or to afford to buy a home in this city. And we need a new round of Mitchell-Lama-like development. That is part of what the council's proposal in the budget response is for. But even faster than that, this program would say, okay, if you're a teacher who could afford, to buy a home for $350, but the home that you're looking at is $7, you'd buy half, and the pension funds would essentially buy the other half. You could live there. When you sold it, you would split the proceeds 50-50, so the pension funds would still see a nice return, but it could create a home ownership opportunity for a new generation of the workers who serve our city. We need a lot more housing creativity, a lot more development, a lot more vouchers, private sector and public sector collaboration, and that I do really think should be priority one for all of us.
Okay, I'm going to let our housing chair, Sanchez, ask some questions.
Thank you so much, Chair Brandon. I just wanted to piggyback on your question on the state budget, and Comptroller. One of the most significant, I think, pieces of feedback or pushback that the council gets when we have these conversations and we make pushes to increase the capital budget in order to meet the housing crisis and build more and preserve more is that the city can't dig our way out on our own. And I don't disagree with that statement. I don't think any of us disagrees with that statement, but I do think that we can do more. And so my question to you is, as our chief fiscal officer in the city of New York, is how do you view how much of the role of the city's capital budget in the fight against the housing crisis? How much, can we be putting in versus our state and federal counterparts?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to connect it to Councilmember Carr's question, because I don't think we appreciate, coming out of the fiscal crisis, in addition to all those fiscal controls, how much the city's pioneering effort to put capital dollars into stopping housing abandonment and housing preservation was a critical part of what brought the city back from the crisis. No other city did anything like it at the time. This city hadn't used capital dollars on housing before. That had always been something the federal government did. But in its moment of need, the city, Mayor Koch realized it and created the 10-year capital plan. And that is a big part of what helped save our neighborhoods and bring them back and build the platform on which we're able to do that signature deal. So spending more capital dollars on, it's not only out of compassion for families, it's the city's economic future that's at stake if we can make this a city that's affordable for the full range of people that occupy it, and we need to do the work as well as just live in the neighborhood. So of course we need more help from the feds and the state, and we have to demand and push and organize, but it would be very short-sighted to say because we aren't getting what we need from the feds or the state, we can't step up either. There are limits to what we can do on the capital side and the operating side, but what I believe what's in the council's budget response, $2.5 million over 5 years, is fiscally prudent, fits within the debt limit, and is wise not just from a housing affordability for families, but a city's future economic and fiscal thriving point of view.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Comptroller. Thank you, Chair.
One last question. The office to housing conversion is something that's important to this council. It was spurred by a bill that this council passed. I wanted to get your input on what you think is the appropriate level of subsidy for these projects with regard to the MCOR program and the votes on 175 Water and 850 3rd Avenue.
Thank you. So I'll point people to the newsletter. We do an economic monthly newsletter, and in the most recent one, the spotlight is on this question of commercial office vacancies. And there's a great box, and I'm going to turn it over to Francesco again, because we go through why we voted yes on 850 and no on 175 water, really taking an analysis of when subsidy is needed. In those, though the MCOR program is not for a conversion to housing. MCOR is to upgrade it to be, you know, an upgraded office building. And I don't know, Francesco, walk through the decisions you. Francesco is our representative on the IDA board and led those votes.
Our view of the MCOR program, which is, you know, there is already as of right benefits, tax benefits for renovation of commercial space. The MCOR adds to that. You know, we looked at the office market and we've seen no real shortage of high quality office space. There is a lot that has been built, there is a lot on the market, you know, and there are certainly some areas of the city, some submarkets and some buildings that for which we could accelerate their upgrading, let's put it that way. And so we thought that, you know, the point of the program is to accelerate and absorb some of this extra supply, rather than necessarily having a permanent impact on the city's economy, right? So there were two projects that were presented so far. One is on 3rd Avenue. It was bought out of essentially bankruptcy. The lender bought the building. There was, you know, there was a plausible scenario such that the existence of an extra subsidy, you know, really triggered the renovation. On the other hand, you know, we looked at the details on the renovation of 175 Water Street. That's, you know, in an area which is prime for conversion to residential, so that's one policy issue. It's the building itself was built after the deadline that would allow the conversion, but surrounding it, it's all conversion to residential. So that's one issue. The other is that it was bought by a company that specializes in that type of renovations for the creative economy and firms. It was bought before the creation of the MCOR program, and they announced that we're doing a transformational, you know, renovation of the building. So in our view, that investment would have happened anyway, even without necessarily the MCOR program or with the as-of-right benefits that were available, and therefore we wouldn't know. It's a great building. It's a great idea. It's just that, in our view, it didn't need the extra money.
Okay, we have questions, Councilmember Powers. We've been joined by Councilmember Brewer.
Thank you. Nice to see you. I want to follow up on that question, that topic. I have a number of eligible buildings in my district. 850 is one of them that are, I think, eager to take advantage of the MCOR program, understanding it and trying to make sense of it. Can you just talk more about your thoughts on the entire program, whether it is deemed will be effective, and similarly, as you're talking about what buildings in the future, I presume there'll be another round or other rounds of that as well. I think there's still money available for that. So what are I think you've talked through a little bit, what are the sort of criteria that one might be looking for if they want to be successful at it, rehabilitation versus maybe a project that could be eligible for other things, but just about what is maybe the right model for that program as we look forward to other projects that might be looking to take advantage of it. I certainly know of some.
Right. So there was one solicitation, and what we've seen in the submissions, there were some that were just not plausible. They were owner-occupied buildings, right? And that's not the program is not meant for those. There are a number of those where the renovation was already being planned, and I think that's something that we care a lot about, because we'd like to have the tax money that would be associated with it, instead of giving a subsidy. I think you want to look at the specific of the projects. Of course, we don't know. The second solicitation went out. The responses are in. We haven't been able to see them. What the EDC did was to lower the threshold for responding to it from 250,000 square feet per building to 100,000. So they're casting a wider net. I think you want to have. I think there are two good things that the MCOR can do. One is to accelerate the upgrading, right? But the second thing that it can do is to sort of revitalize the street life right? And so that's something that is not often done with the EDC, right, and IDA subsidies. And that's because, IDA doesn't do retail, particularly in Manhattan, right? But, it's a good, component of the program to be able to create street life, right? Because, the point is to try to create mixed-use neighborhoods. And so to the extent that you see, a building that would not otherwise have made the investment, that can be upgraded, can, get and soak up this extra supply, and at the same time, create the opportunities for, street life and retail and childcare, those are the things that we would look for.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Controller, your team, thank you very much. We look forward to working with you. Appreciate your analysis.
Congrats on getting to the end of your testimony here, and thank you for your time, and thanks to the staff and the other members.
Thanks, guys. All right, we'll take a little break, and then we're going to hear from IBO at around 11 o'clock.